Welcome to Feminine Roadmap Podcast. I'm your host, Gina-R-Farrar. Each week, I bring you an inspiring conversation to help you navigate the challenges and changes of midlife so that you can not only survive, but thrive in your second half. Hello, Feminine Roadmappers. It is Gina here, and today we are going to be talking about being willing to get lost to all of the things we should be so that we can learn to listen to ourselves. It's about practicing who we are on the inside, those qualities we wish we had more of, and how living those qualities elevates our lives. And to have this conversation with me today is Victoria Price. She's the author of The Way of Being Lost and Living Love, the 12 Heart-Centered Practices. Victoria, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
It is my pleasure. Now, I would love to hear your story. What is it that led you to write these two books?
Well, one morning, sort of as I was nearing 50, I found myself looking in the mirror. And I heard myself listing everything I was doing right. And that caught my attention because at that time and for much of my life, I was pretty filled with self-loathing. So the idea that I would be listing all the things that I was doing right was, a little surprising. And I had picked my life up from being a big mess, like millions of dollars in debt and everything falling apart and losing everything. And it was healing. Everything was healing. And I had all the things that you're supposed to have, a wonderful partner, and I was living in a lovely house in a town that I loved and everything. And I heard this list. And then what I heard myself say to myself was, you're doing everything right. And then there was this nice sort of pause. And then what I heard was, and you're miserable. And I was like, oh, yeah, I am. And then there was another pause. And then I heard myself say to myself, and if you have to live like this for another 40 years, you won't make it. And that was the moment where I vowed to change my life. So, if that's what had happened, bing, bang, boom, the little, magic wand that doesn't exist had been waved over my life, I wouldn't have written the books. Because, of course, vowing to change your life is very different from changing your life. But I had a little head sort of leg up. It was 2011, and 2011 would have been my dad's 100th birthday. And my dad was an actor named Vincent Price, and he was very, very beloved, is very beloved. He still has, 250,000 Facebook fans, and he's been gone 26 years. And people were organizing these celebrations all over the world called the Vincentennial, which was very clever. And so he was just loved. And I had written a biography of him, not because I'm the world's greatest expert on movies, but because at the end of his life, we'd sat around and talked about the things we loved. And people wanted a biography out of me. And I said, I'm not the best person qualified to write about all the movies. But when I realized that the things that really mattered as much or maybe more to him than the whole acting career would be forgotten if I didn't, I did it. And so because I was his biographer and his daughter, they wanted me to come out. And I thought, you know what? I'm not going to do what I did on that book tour 10 years earlier. I'm going to actually do something different. I'm going to try to share with these fans who just wish they could have met him what he was like. So instead of talking about what he did with his life, I'm going to try to sort of stand in his shoes and share how he lived his life. And in that way, maybe convey what it felt like to be around him. That was my intention. Of course, what happened in doing that was I remembered who he was. And one of the things that had been making me so miserable is that I had become a workaholic. Now, I had three parents, a mother, a stepmother, and a dad, all of whom were workaholics. They all had very, very long, successful careers. And I seemed to have, gleaned that part of the legacy, but forgotten the real legacy, which was this legacy of joy and love. And so as I would stand there talking with fans and sharing who he was, or I would give these talks and I would share who he was, I was just filled with joy. And I knew then that's how I was going to turn my life around. And that whole year was an amazing year. And then, of course, that year ended, and I was working full time during that whole time, but that year ended, and I thought, wow, well, I know it's joy that's going to turn everything around, but how do I have that without that as my excuse? And it took another couple of years and a number of other bottoms that I hit until one day I heard this little voice in my head say, you need to create a daily practice of joy. Now, by this time, I at least had learned to listen to myself a little better. And I thought, yeah, that's right. I do. I need to stop talking about joy and saying joy is the answer, and I need to practice it every day. But then I thought, well, how the heck do you practice something that's an emotion, a feeling that's supposed to be something that's intuitive? So I read everything I could about practice, and it kind of drilled down to being 4 things: daily, doing something daily, doing it instead of just talking about doing it daily, deliberately, consciously, and committedly. So I thought, okay, that's what practice means: doing instead of talking, consciously, committedly, daily, and deliberately. But how do you do that with joy? Like, what is joy? I know what joy feels like. And so again, I went to the dictionary, which I always love doing, and I saw this definition that just made my heart sing. It said, joy is the pure and simple delight in being alive. And I was like, yes, that's exactly how I feel when I'm in joy. And joy gets me out of my workaholic head and into my heart. Okay, I'm going to practice that. And I was like, well, but how am I going to do that? And what came through to me was to go back to childhood when joy was innate. And so I thought, what did I love doing as a kid? Well, I loved animals. I loved birds. I loved playing with my dog. I loved smelling the roses. I loved binge watching I Love Lucy. I thought of all these things that brought me joy as a kid. And I started out by practicing those. And then what happened was I realized that for 20 minutes a day and 30 minutes a day and 40 minutes a day, as I practiced joy, I was shifted out of this problem mindset. I'm a person with this problem. I'm a workaholic. I can't seem to find joy in my life. I struggle with self-loathing, all of these things. And in that time where I was practicing joy, I was living as if I was already that joyful person that I knew myself to be inside. And that was the light bulb moment. And gradually, so I began practicing joy. I began writing a blog called Daily Practice of Joy, which I've been writing now for 5 years, I guess. And really what happened was that then every time something came up in my life that I needed to shift, I would try to identify what it was that not what the problem was, but what it was that I wanted to sort of feel or stand in or emanate. And then I would begin practicing that. And what I came to realize was that practice shifts us out of the problem fear-based mentality into the love heart-centered mentality. Well, not even mentality, being, And when we do that, we bypass all this programming that we've been given from the time we were little kids, and we step back into the hearts of our truest selves. And when that happens, everything shifts, not because we're shifting it, but because when we realign with love, with the big L, love, the power that I am convinced is behind everything, then we are invoking that power back into our lives. And then love does what love does, which is love us back whole.
Fantastic. You talked about learning what the practice is. What exactly do you mean? Like you would start to practice that? Because it's kind of a concept to quote, practice joy. So can you give me an example of something you recognized and how you actually applied that practice to your life?
So I'm a walker. I love to walk. I'm not a good sitter. I'm not a good sitting meditator. I'm a mover. So I knew that I had to find a way to shift out of the workaholism, and everyone's like, meditate, sit. Well, yeah, easy for you to say. I'm a walker, I'm a mover. So first of all, I began to realize that there were things like walking meditation and moving meditation. But my walking and moving meditation became joy. And joy was for me looking deeply at everything I saw, interacting with it, sometimes photographing it. Like I often take portraits of flowers when I walk. if there's puddles, jumping in the puddles, if there's flowers, smelling the flowers, if there's birds, stopping and looking and finding the birds, appreciating the weeds that are growing, looking up at the blue sky and taking the time to be grateful for it, interacting with my dog or other people and their dogs. Sometimes if it was a different kind of shift, I would listen to music or a podcast or go for a walk with a friend, and there would be this sort of deep unpacking. But one of the things that I realized happened was that movement for me, as opposed to sitting, sort of shifts me out of the head into the heart. And so what practice really is anything, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this in a moment, but anything that shifts us out of the habit of fear and back into the practice of love. So it's something, one of the things that I teach people is how to figure out what practices resonate for them. Because in the book, I give 12 different practices, but each of them has many different possibilities or iterations, and people get to try them out. And also, for some people, like the word joy might not resonate, but there might be another word that does. For example, one of my dearest friends, her word that really recenters her is balance. So when she feels out of whack or in fear, it's how does she practice balance to get herself back into that place, which she knows is her core place, which is balance.
Okay. So what I hear you saying is it's really about engaging in the life that's happening in the moment.
Yes, but not from our heads.
Right.
So in other words, we can engage all we want, but if we're saying, in a very sort of cerebral way, look, there's 12 more leaves on that tree than there were yesterday, that's still keeping us in our heads. But if it's like, oh my God, it rained and look at the drops and how beautiful they are on that leaf, ching, ching, and all of a sudden we're down into our hearts.
It's engaging the emotional side of the experience, not just the visual side.
Yeah, although I'm a visual person, so for me, the visual triggers my heart.
Right.
And I think each person is different, and that's part of how, practice is a very individual thing. Let's look at a sports person. Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal are two of the greatest players of all time. They have very different sets of skills. They're good human beings and great friends. But if Roger Federer tried to practice how, Rafa Nadal practices, he'd probably injure himself, and if Rafa Nadal tried to practice how Roger Federer practices, well, first of all, one's right-handed and one's left-handed, or plays right-handed and left-handed, who we are as individuals. So each of them has evolved a practice. And then there comes a point in their tennis lives where their serve falls apart, or they're not, succeeding. They can't talk their way back into it. They have to go back onto the court and find new ways of practicing because their mentality has changed, or their body has changed, or the sport has changed because there's young people hitting the heck out of the ball, so that practice is constantly morphing and changing individually. But the key is love with the big L. There is something that drives all of this, and it is the thing we've forgotten. What we're practicing is realigning with love and stop listening to fear.
It's interesting. Fear takes on so many different manifestations. Don't you agree?
Oh, totally. Fear is the master shapeshifter. You bet. It's really, really good. Here's the thing. Fear is a parasite, and we're its host bodies. Think about something that is on the wane right now. I'll give you an example of the print media, newspapers, for example. So there are moments where something is, being phased out, and before the new iteration of what it's going to be becomes the norm, or it just ends, because it's no longer needed, there's this kind of desperate moment where they're selling themselves, and every 5 seconds you're saying, join this, get this, buy this. Well, that's fear, because the bottom line is if we get hip to fear and realize like we no longer need that subscription to that version of fear, fear doesn't exist without us. For example, the coronavirus, is apparently out in the world. It needs humans to do its dirty work. And that's really what fear does. Fear needs us, otherwise what is it doing? Are the trees scared? Or the birds scared? I don't think so. The flowers don't look terrified. And so, the bottom line is we have to buy into it, and it's going to sell itself to us. There's a wonderful sociological study by a guy named Barry Glassner about the 3 narrative techniques of fear-mongering that are used in the media. And he explains why over the last 20, 25 years, we have become the most fearful country in the statistically safest time to be alive in history. And that's because the fear-mongering in the media, which is conscious and uses these 3 techniques over and over again. Well, they're fears techniques. They're just, used by the media. Fear is nothing except if we buy the subscription.
So this overall picture of really reconnecting is we're not just seeing things, we're feeling the things, we're connecting to how we're impacted by things. We are engaging, we're appreciating, we're really seeing from our heart the things and the people that are around us. And it sounds like in the doing of that, it gives us a different pair of glasses that actually gives us a more realistic view of what is going on. It separates us from that imaginary world that fear creates.
Absolutely. And part of the practices also are some house cleaning, because we actually have to learn how fear gets our ear. Otherwise, we're never going to know. And once we understand, for example, many, many years ago, my best friend, we would have this hilarious exchange. And she would say to me, I just bought some donuts or cookies or whatever. No, that was me. Actually, I've forgotten. She's no longer alive. It was backwards. She would come to me and she said, I just bought some chips. And I bought like 3 bags. I was not on a binge, and she'd hand me 2.5 bags of chips. And I'd be like, what am I supposed to do with this? And she said, just keep them in your house so I don't have access to them. And I thought that was such a brilliant idea that if I would go on a binge because mine was cookies, I'd get through half the thing and then I'd take them over to her house. We lived about 10 minutes away from each other. Well, it really helped because that actually, her acknowledgement of what her trigger food was helped me see what mine was. Well, that's some of the practices in the book. So when we learn how fear gets our ear, and when we understand that fear is a habit, and in most cases an unconscious habit, then we can learn to identify it. So one of the really interesting practices in the book, again, these are all things that I have learned, through my own experimentation or things I've read and adapted to myself. This is a Ram Dass practice called witnessing that I've adapted into my own life, but it's essentially learning how to listen to your thoughts and your thoughts about yourself, your thoughts about situations, your thoughts about others without judgment. So you learn to be able to witness yourself, and that really helps with fear, because often if we're not witnessing ourselves and we're in that, oh, there she goes again. She's, I just finished this project, and as usual, she's got something helpful to say about it. Thank you so much, for that helpful thing. Do you know what you sound like? So if you feel the trigger, and sometimes it's a strong trigger, and you're starting down that road, oh, there she goes again. And then you go up, 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 up. Oh, right. You're triggered. Okay. So this keeps happening. What's the trigger? Don't judge yourself. Don't judge yourself for being triggered, but acknowledge that every time this happens, it's a trigger. And each time you do that, first of all, you recognize that if you're not on the big roller coaster ride with the, loop-de-loops and the corkscrews, that it's really not that much fun to be triggered. So then you begin to recognize it, and you want it to actually change sooner rather than later. And so, you go from a week-long, binge of trigger to sometimes shifting out of it in an hour and a half, so that then, I had this happen recently, a place where I got triggered, and the next day the reverse happened, and I was able to watch myself want to give some super helpful advice that would not have been so nice and helpful, and certainly wouldn't have been received that way, and go, oh, that's the reverse trigger. And you don't really want to do that. You're not going to feel good. They're not going to feel good. What's the point? And, 10 minutes later, I could laugh about it. So when we identify and learn to witness our thoughts and learn how to not judge them, we recognize that actually there's the trained fear-based thinking. And underneath that is this still small voice that is our true self, that isn't triggered, that always has the calming, balanced, joy-filled, centering, holistic answer, or at least place to land. And we get better and better at going back to that rather than flailing around in our fear-based responses.
Mm. When you talk about triggers, it's really powerful how embedded some of those triggers really are in who we are. A lot of those things were given to us, if you will, gifted to us in an odd sort of way in our childhood.
Oh, yeah.
And we go through life with these triggers, not realizing how much of our life is reactive.
Oh, yeah. And, the triggers that are the hardest are the ones that came from our parents or our peers, people who said they were sharing them for our benefit. It was one of the things in the book before this one, The Way of Being Lost. I wrote about 3 stories that kept circling up and circling up and circling up. And I came to call them the unholy trinity of my self-loathing. I recognized that there were 3 things that my mother told me. And because she told them to me from a fear-based place, I heard them in fear. And she said them more than once. They became ingrained as my story. Every time something happened that triggers those, I went to a place of fear and eventually to a place of self-loathing. They became completely invisible, and I had to write them out and write the stories to unpack them. And eventually, I had this huge healing around my mother. I had this real shift. I have to say, I have this wonderful friend named Mary, and an older friend, and she once said to me, I was talking about self-loathing. She said, I just have to stop you. She said, so I have to tell you, I hadn't ever heard the term self-loathing till you said it. And every time you say it, I think about it. And I have to say, self-loathing, it just sounds like the bottom of the barrel. And I burst out laughing because she loves me and she meant it sort of as a reflection back, like, I don't see you that way. And there was something so straight up about that. I was like, yeah, it pretty much is the bottom of the barrel, And I thought, well, let's get cracking, unpacking those stories and getting rid of them. And, I'm sitting here talking to you and reflecting, I think that self-loathing that was just always there, it hasn't really cropped up in a while. And here's fear for you. I find myself looking around for something wooden to knock on. And I'm not even superstitious because it's like, but I had very visceral responses. Physical responses to that self-loathing, and to not feel that is such a gift. So that's, again, living out of your heart instead of your fear-based head. And yes, some of that crap is, hold.
And to some degree, there are pets. Like, that's what we know. That's what we're comfortable with.
Yes.
And it feels protective because we know it. But in some odd sort of way, it's a bit like inflicting wounds upon ourselves. When we re-traumatize ourselves with those fears, we re-traumatize ourselves with those stories. And I love the idea of asking that question, what stories keep circling up? What is that voice screaming at you, and writing it down? Because when we turn and face it, when we give it a name or a face, do you understand what I'm saying? Like, it's no longer just happening in our bodies. We're actually putting it on paper and looking at it as if it's something outside of us. Like, wait a minute, whose voice is this? Where is this coming from? And one of the questions I encourage people to ask is it true? Not true because I've been saying it, but true. Like, is this really a truth?
Yes.
Am I really that negative, whatever it is, a loser? Or you always do that? You never do anything right? Whatever the story is, man, it's so powerful to get it out of our heads and give it some shape, if you will. By writing it on paper, it's like giving it a body where you can actually look at it and observe it and give it some space to go, wait a minute. you can almost stand back from it. Is that kind of what you found?
Absolutely. The writing it out, I think, allows it to, things become so invisible that we actually don't see it. And so writing it out, it's like, oh, wow, look at that. Yes, absolutely. And I think, the other thing too is I love that question. And for me, I love the work of Byron Katie, and she asks you to really drill down. Is it true? Is it really true? And what would you be without that? I recognize that my mother, my poor mother, who really tried to do the best she could for me, not necessarily with, always, she hadn't healed a lot of the fear in her. So some of the messages came across from a fear-based place, but she was dead and I was still blaming everything on her. It's like, oh yeah, that was my mother. It's like, really? But I think it's time to let that go.
There's a lot of those stories that I hear in myself and in other people. And one of the things that I've noticed, Victoria, is when it comes to triggers and stories, a lot of the time, if somebody says or does something and it has like that really irritating effect on me, I've come to recognize that there's something in that that's being a mirror to me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not separate from that thing and I think you know what I'm saying. It's like you're triggered by another person, or something that people are doing is just irritating you. Sometimes I pause and go, okay, all right, this is a little bit too irritating, meaning what is it about this that's shining back at me that I need to be aware of?
Absolutely. I think, we're projectors, and people come into our lives as, the screen on which we can see our crap. How else are we going to see it? And, that's absolutely, I think, in this global crisis, we have studiously ignored, all the things that we haven't wanted to see about ourselves as human beings. And this is this big mirror for us to have an opportunity to shift some of these behaviors that we let ourselves become blind to because we just didn't want to deal with it. We just didn't want to deal with it.
You talked about your mom and that story of fear. That's something we need to be aware of, isn't it? That who in our life are we listening to? That whole thing about the 5 people you spend the most time with, they're going to have the greatest impact on who you are and who you become. Not judging them, but I think there is an observing that needs to take place in our community, like in the community that we live in, meaning the people that we live our lives, do life with, share our life with. Okay, I need to be aware of how we're bumping up against each other.
Absolutely.
And find those trigger points and try to grow together, because it is so true how powerful our parents are in what we believe about ourselves. And sometimes we don't even realize that impact.
Oh yeah, no, we don't see it at all. And it's so funny. There are certain people historically who've been very critical of me, like, how long are you going to ride on your father's coattails? And I'm like, I'm actually really not riding on my father's coattails, because what 58-year-old really wants to walk around and their entire life be called so-and-so's daughter? It's like, A, he's dead, and B, I am like barely anyone's daughter anymore. But the reason I talk about my dad is because he gave me, and was he perfect? No, not at all. He'd be the first to tell you that, and I'd be like, yep, that's exactly correct. But he taught me unconditional love. And he has so many fans still, not because he was the greatest actor in the world, but because he showed up in every single person's life with this immense love, open-mindedness, open-heartedness. He saw people, he paid attention to people. He was just this profoundly beautiful human being. And, people still want to connect with that feeling because that's what they want. They're not getting it from him. They're getting it. Something came through him. So that's why I keep my father in my life. Becoming conscious of that really taught me, like, well, then why do I keep the negative stuff? There was a lot of stuff my dad could have done way, way better, but I let go of that negative stuff because the love came in and pushed that out. And I saw, well, that's just human frailty. But what I got from him in the way of love, well, it was much harder to do with my mother, because the lesson she gave me absolutely have saved my life over and over again. But the fear that came with them was so pervasive. And so I think the thing that really we have to do is be willing to clear the fear over and over and over and over and over and over again. And when we do that, all of a sudden we can drill down, and it's healing not just to us here, but to everyone we're going to meet down the line. But it also has this sort of release of those people, whether they're here still or not, that we're holding in this fear-based energy. And I remember after that became one of my heart-centered practices, this real releasing of all my mother's stories. There was one day I was walking along on this beautiful hike, and I was like, something's missing. It was like I viscerally felt like something's missing. And I was sort of like, my car keys, what did I forget? The water bottle. It's like my mother. All that whole story about my mother is missing. And since then, I just view my mother with so much love, and I'm so grateful for her. So, I think it's a really interesting thing to recognize that we have to do the work, but once we do it, then that love comes in and shifts it.
Mm. And what I hear you saying is we aren't denying what has happened to us, how it impacted us. That's not the conversation. The conversation is, while that may be true, how then shall I live? Because that person's made their decisions, whether they did it intentionally or those were the only tools they had, right? That's what they brought to the table. And for whatever reason, they didn't have the drive or the understanding to grow. But we get to choose. Like there's this separation. I feel that it's difficult for some people to separate themselves from those parental relationships or those very deep, intimate relationships. And I think fear plays a double role. The fear keeps us believing those things, but it also makes us think that if we do something different, there'll be this great loss.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, that thing that you described, that's absolutely it. We're witnessing that right now in our lives as people are being forced to give up all or many of our distractions, and what we can't see the profound healing that's happening because the focus on what we're having to give up because it's familiar is more prevalent than the simple gratitude for what is shifting. Because the fact of the matter is, we live in a splashy roller coaster ride, diversions and distractions, next big thing world. And the things that are changing in us all are realigning us with a very simple, quiet, much more centered way of living, but it's not sexy. And so, we're so used to wanting that next thing that we don't know how to see and feel the gift of this, the quiet shifts. And if somebody reads my book and they're like, oh, fantastic, I'm going to go out and practice joy, I'm going to buy myself a new car, and you can't afford that car, then you have to do something that I call the joy equation. Same with like, oh, I'm going to get a new pair of shoes. Well, how are you going to feel about that credit card debt? Fine, I can afford the shoes. Well, how about the carbon footprint that goes with it? How about the fact that you have 20 shoes in the closet that you never wear? And I'm talking about me here. So, I've had to really ask myself, like, there's real joy and there's fake joy too. And inevitably when it's heart-based, it's this very calm, quiet feeling of rightness. And that's not something we're used to hearing.
You mentioned just this kind of global pause. That's what I call it. It feels like a global pause to me. Like there's a global mute button that's been hit. And aside from the impacts financially and all that sort of thing, if we can kind of weed through the harsh realities for some people, if we could be still in this moment, I don't know that in our lifetime, it's probably never happened I don't think it's happened in our lifetime where we've had this opportunity to literally pause and be so present with life without all the notifications and the pings and the calls and the this and the that. Some people's lives haven't slowed down, but for a lot of us, it's a moment to really reevaluate, which goes along with what you're saying. Who am I in the midst of this life that I'm living? Where do I fit into the scheme of the life that I'm living? Is it my life, or is it a life that I think I'm supposed to, quote, should be living, right? I feel like it's a great opportunity to reevaluate ourselves and the way we're showing up in our own lives, in our families' lives, in our work. For some people, it's really shifted them to realize, wait a minute, I don't want to be identified as a workaholic. Or wait a minute, yeah, I've done this, I might be good at it, but this isn't what brings me joy. Like being able to actually say, I'm working from home, and you're getting more connected to maybe home where you haven't been because you've worked 80 hours a week. It's been very interesting. I feel like for a lot of people, this global mute button, if we use it properly, will be a really great tool to help, like you're saying, become more conscious of, wait a minute, is this something that I think I should be doing? Or is this something I really want to be doing? And how can I turn this ship around if it needs to be turned around?
Well, and let's be real, let's look at things that happen when we get way out of whack. And let's take two. Let's imagine, we overeat or we overspend. So there is no quick fix to obesity. The surgeries, are maybe a quicker, but it's not easy. And, unless you win the lottery or your great Aunt Tilly dies, there's no quick fix to, huge debt. Both things take conscious practice to change, or you will fix something and you're going to balloon back up again in weight or in debt. And one of the things that I think that this pause is giving us a chance to look at, and this is the unpleasant part, but this is how it ties into the debt and the weight gain, that breaking ourselves of the habit of spending and breaking ourselves of the habit of overeating, it's not going to be easy. And there's going to be this real sense of withdrawal. And when we lose the weight or get back to a place of, manageable, reasonable finances, if we've ever even been there, we can't run back to the old way of being. And so there are things that are going to get lost in the process. And so there's a new paradigm that has to be created. Well, I think that's what's happening, and the fact of the matter is at least the United States is not a culture that likes to be told it can't have what it wants when it wants it right now. And yet, if we actually lived as a world where we recognize that the quiet things are actually what we want, nobody on their deathbed says, woo, I'm sure glad I bought those 6 Ferraris and, I'm leaving my children with $2 million of debt, but I'm glad I spent every penny of it. Nobody said, boy, I'm sure glad I was that workaholic and did all of that stuff. That's not what happens at the end. And so the bottom line is, if, I say this all the time, but I really mean it. We're taught all these things in school, who fought the War of 1812 and what date was the Battle of Appomattox. Well, and unless you're a Civil War reenactor or live in Baltimore, you really don't need to know either of those things on a daily basis. And the fact of the matter is, a general idea that there was conflicts and, that the Civil War was about freeing the slaves and brother against brother, like that's important to know. Really doesn't matter where Appomattox was or what happened there. But we're all taught to memorize that and our grades depend on it. And no one, not from first grade on, says, and now we're going to have our half an hour class on listening to your heart. That's never said. I mean, we all know the other things that aren't said either. Nobody teaches you how to balance a bank account. Nobody tells you anything about raising children, nothing. But this is the most basic. Nobody ever says, and today we're going to, listen to your heart. And, we're going to work on that as a practice. And it's going to be a part of, your curriculum here in this program. So we grow up thinking that is, some Hallmark card woo-woo crap that is really irrelevant. If we were brought up to listen to our hearts, every decision we make would be different. And this turnaround, this global pause wouldn't be so stressful. I even wonder whether we would have gotten to this as a world, because if you listen to your heart, Are you going to be caging wild animals and selling them? Probably not. If you're listening to your heart, do you really want to live cheek to jowl next to people? No. So the whole world would look really, really different. The bottom line is, if we can make that a practice and that begins to happen, it all trickles out. Our choices we make are different. Our reality is different. And so, yeah, there's growing pains, believe when you give up everything you own, and everything you own lives in a 10 by 10 storage unit, and you live on the road for 4 years. I am still a nomad. I do not have a home. You have to give up a lot, and it's a learning curve. I have a thing for shoes, much better if I'd had a thing for t-shirts if you live in your car, but shoes, they cost more money than t-shirts and they take up a lot of space. And getting me out of buying the habit of shoes, and I don't really have the money to be buying just random shoes that I leave in storage units around the country. But that's that habit, because shoes were something that my mother told me, because I was really tall and grew too much, I could only have the knockoff versions of. So in my little head, those shoes make me the cool kid, except that I only really can wear 3 of them because I live on the road.
I am amazed at how our lives are so directed by what feel like offhanded comments like that, the way that we perceive them. And when you're talking about building those soft skills, those intuitive skills, those heart-centered skills, if we were not given those skills or taught those skills by the adults in our life growing up, there comes a point, and I'm thinking back to releasing those that we see or perceive have shorted us somehow. I always talk about personal responsibility. There's a point where we have to stand up and be adults and say, okay, maybe that is true, that I didn't get X, Y, and Z, or that I wanted that and didn't get it for whatever reason. What am I going to do now? How can I build those skills into my life now? It's that idea of kind of stepping up to the plate and really taking full responsibility for the life that you have, becoming aware of those things that are holding us back. And that does require us to connect to our hearts, to even know ourselves, because what you're saying is know yourself better. And not only know yourself better, but learn to trust yourself and live from that place. And I think that's where fear may creep in and say, but the family doesn't do it that way. But you've never done this before. But nobody's going to understand, or whatever the story is, right? That's that flip side of fear. The fear keeps you from change, or it keeps you thinking you can't. But when you actually do start to do it, then it starts to spin the story. And so what I hear you saying is each person, no matter how our life has played out, I feel like this quarantine has kind of brought some of that to the surface. There's a lot of things I'm observing. It's very interesting. It's kind of like a great big, what's the word I want? Almost like a boiling pot. We always call the world a melting pot. This is the opposite. There's things bubbling up to the surface. And one concept that's been on my mind that you kind of touched on is that butterfly effect. That's been on my mind a lot lately, and how, they say this butterfly in the Amazon flaps its wings, and how that affects weather halfway across the world. Somehow there's this effect. And I think about what you're encouraging people to do is a lot like that butterfly effect. We can flap our wings more authentically, more connectedly, more mindfully, and that will cause a different ripple. We don't have to stay in the ripple we're in. We have the choice to create a different impact in ripple, and know that it will cause that no matter whether or not we see it. Just having faith in knowing that as I become more me and the better version of me, it matters in the greater world.
Absolutely. Here's the thing, sometimes my best friend and I were sort of spiritual workout partners, and she'll harangue at me at that my ideas are too pie in the sky. And I said, I don't really think so, because if I'm practicing staying in my heart, and the way I go out into the world is in my heart, and somebody cuts me off, and I don't, and I am a world-class cursor. I have such a fantastic range of expletives right at my fingertips, and they're creative, because I came from very creative swearers growing up. But if I'm in my heart, I watch the trigger. And I'm like, instead of going, you, blah, 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 I think, wow, they must be having a really rough time right now. Wow, they must be really stressed. Wow. This happened 3 times in 24 hours where 3 people swerved in front of me, almost made me hit them, made other people hit them to make their point that something I did pissed them off. I drove too slowly. I didn't go through the light quickly enough, whatever it was. And instead of having that reaction, I witnessed my reaction because everybody reacts. And then I let it go and went to a place of compassion. Well, had I not, then I'm riled up and I'm driving along and I'm pissed off. And the next thing that happens, all of a sudden I'm behaving like that person, but instead I get to a stop sign. And this is happening a lot now. Maybe it was like beginning of March, I had that was that day where that happened. Ever since, basically mid-March, it's like a politeness contest at every single light. People are like, you first, you first. I was literally at one point stopping to photograph some tulips on my daily practice of joy. And there was a person pulled up at a crosswalk. And I was at this crosswalk photographing the tulips. He rolled down his window, passenger window, and he said, we were just stopping for you because we thought you were going to cross. Like he wanted me to know. And I was like, that is so nice of you. I just was photographing these tulips. So you go ahead. He said, you sure? I'm like, yeah, I'm going to be here too. We had this entire chat about going across a crosswalk. And this happens all the time. And then everybody ends up laughing, because we're all like it's like the Marx Brothers here with crossing a crosswalk. Well, tell me that doesn't have a trickle down effect. People say it's a little thing. It's not. If I'm the jerk and somebody's had a bad day of work and that's why they ran the stop sign or were a jerk, they've had the bad day. And then I'm like, you, and I honk at them and that just riles them up more. Then they go home. Well, who knows what happens when they get home? One energy shift, it is that butterfly effect. Absolutely.
Mm. Isn't that interesting? It's like stepping out of the moment and looking at that effect. When I worked in retail, in cosmetics, this woman and her husband came in and it was fairly clear that he was not a good man.
Mm.
And I have a problem with those kind of men.
Mm.
So I was heavily, heavily triggered. And at the time, because my mom was married to an abusive alcoholic in my formative years, I had this heightened trigger.
Right.
We're just going to call it a trigger because it was nothing less than that. Could have been more, but it was nothing less. and I had an uncle who was like that. And he was in our lives being abusive as well. And so when I became an adult, that was one of my personal things is like, that is not happening to me. And don't even think about it. Like I will hunt you down if you even think. I was very Rambo when I was younger about this issue. And this man was really not handling his wife well. She just wanted a lipstick. And he was behaving in a way that was clearly abusive in a controlling, very awful way. And I knew it in my body. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I could feel it. And I was starting to try to, quote, make a point.
Mm.
And I wasn't inappropriate, but I know what was in my heart. Let's just leave it at that.
Right, sure.
And I was like, he was basically telling her what she couldn't do and how she couldn't do it. And he had that body stance. It was like the whole thing was just everything in me. And I worked at a higher end store. So customer service is like, so I couldn't behave badly.
Right.
That was probably a good thing. But I did start kind of pushing back against him and it triggered him.
Mm.
And it was simple little things like, I don't like that. And I looked at her and I said, well, you're the one wearing it. Do you like it? And I could see her start to gather fear.
Yes.
And after like the second or third time, this is a matter of 10 minutes. It wasn't quick. I realized, I had this moment where I realized you have to stop because she's going to pay the price.
Yes.
Whether or not you're right, which I was, by the way. The guy was a jerk. But she was fully in his grasp. And one lipstick could mean that she could go home and have the crap beat out of her because I tried to make her stand up for herself and give him the message that it's just none of his fill in the blank business what color lipstick she wears. And so I was in my 30s at that time, so I still hadn't fully dealt with, I was working on it, but these things come slow, like you said earlier. And so there really is a reality to, we just don't know who we're engaging with. And the more conscious that we can be, we don't know how we're literally doing something that will benefit someone we will never meet, like you're saying.
Exactly. No, there's that famous story of the person who, and whether it's apocryphal or not, who knows, but, who made a hair appointment, and they came in and, and they sat down at the chair, and the hairdresser did what the hairdresser always does. Because in addition to cutting hair, one of the things he loved to do is check in with his clients. It's a 2-part job as far as he's concerned, cutting the hair and, being there to have those kind of intimate conversations that you have with your hairdresser. And this was somebody that he'd never had before. So they just chatted, and, he cut her hair and spent a bunch of time with her. And when she left, she was beaming, and she said, "I love my haircut. Thank you so much." And a week later, he got a letter or an email or whatever saying, I just want you to know your kindness saved my life. I made the appointment to get my hair cut because I was planning on killing myself that night. And I'm alive because of your kindness. We don't know. We absolutely don't know. And here's a story. So, my dad made horror movies. And I cannot tell you the number of people, literally so many, who have come up to me and said, your dad got me through my childhood. And when they first started telling me this, I was like, okay, because I don't like violence and I don't like horror movies, and I couldn't really quite figure out what the connection was. They would tell me they came from a horribly, horribly abusive childhood, and they were drawn to horror movies, I think, because of that. And my dad, who I said was this huge, huge bright light of love, there was something about that came through everything he did. And people would say to me, and they were shy at first. Now everybody in the horror world knows, that I love horror fans and, not horror movies, but horror fans. But they would say to me, I hope this doesn't sound weird to you, but I would imagine that he was my dad, or I would imagine he was my uncle, or I would imagine he was my grandfather. And he really, that's what got me through my childhood. And I had this epiphany maybe about 5-6 years ago, where I realized that I don't like horror movies, don't get it at all, but we do share something that we both love. And that's my dad. That the same bright light that made me adore my dad is the exact same bright light they felt. And, I didn't get it through the horror movies because I didn't watch those, but I got it through, when he was home and we were making popovers together, or when we were walking on the beach. It doesn't matter how it comes through. And so here's this person, who theoretically was just an actor, but the way he treated people and his generosity of spirit and his love came through everything he did, and it saved people's lives. Now, you explain that, because that equation doesn't make a lot of sense. But that's the power of love. It comes through us. And so absolutely what we do, if that's not the butterfly effect, you explained to me how the king of horror saved, watching some, who was lopping someone's head off in a movie, saved someone's life from an abusive, got them through and got them to believe that they could grow up and be an adult. Makes no sense. It's as illogical as the butterfly wing in the typhoon. But that's the power of love.
And that would express how your father lived from a place of love, what you talk about and what you're learning and sharing. And because that's what we're all doing, right? We're learning. And that next level is sharing.
Yep.
And so that's a legacy that he's
totally. Love is my legacy. All these years, I thought it was many other things, including celebrity, which I was uncomfortable with. No, my legacy is love. And I wrote the book because at one point I thought, this works. And then I worked with clients, and first I shared it with friends, then I worked with clients, and, and people use it and I see it work. But you have to sort of suspend your judgment, because, it's not like one of those things where you say, and in 4 weeks, you're going to have 6-pack abs. Yeah, in 4 weeks, your life actually will look really different. But I can't show you the 6-pack ab results, because actually you have to show up and do it. Because that you are tired of being a fear-based problem solver.
Yeah, I hear that. Sometimes the fear is so loud because the knowing is growing. And the fear's got to stay in the power seat, right?
Yes. Right. It's that's selling its subscription. Buy, 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 buy. It's like those ads that pop up on Facebook. And, I'm always grateful that at least the ads that pop up, like, I feel like, thank God I don't have any really horrible, addictive buying behaviors. Thank God it's all shoes, and I'm not seeing like something that would be really embarrassing if somebody looked at my Facebook feed. But, it's a little bit embarrassing how many shoe ads pop up on my Facebook or Instagram feed, So that's like fear, we get in that groove, what do we think all this stuff is modeled on? It's modeled. Here's one for you. So pharmaceutical advertising has increased something like 400% over the last 20 years. I mean, as you know, not right now, but as you know, almost every ad during certain, broadcasts is just big pharma, big pharma, big pharma. So, okay, you have a hangnail or you have hemorrhoids, some fairly benign thing. And if you take this is absolutely going to get rid of it. And then they have to, by law, tell you the list of things that could happen. You will no longer have hemorrhoids, but you'll grow 3 heads, 5 legs. You will, have, an anaphylactic shock and, die 3 times before. Right. Yeah. In unpleasant ways. So they have to say that. Well, one of the things that they found, and these are people who are experts in pharmaceutical advertising, they found that the more they mentioned the dangerous effects of a particular drug, the more people wanted the drug, because they felt that if Big Pharma was willing to make something and the FDA would pass something to heal hemorrhoids or hangnails that was that dangerous, it must be worth taking. That's literally what the research shows, that we are more willing to do something if it is deemed to have very dangerous consequences. And so that's how fear works. Fear gets our ear in all kinds of ways. If you give this up, which is some kind of fear-based thinking, then this bad thing's going to happen to you. And we have to learn to stop listening that way.
Yeah, we're either operating from fear or love. And I think when we simplify it to that, we can really begin to evaluate, okay, am I coming at this from fear? Even if it's elusive, it's not as obvious that it's fear, kind of digging down, it takes work. And I would encourage people to honor that process because it's so worth it on the other side. So we've come to the top of our hour, and this has just been such a great conversation. But we have talked about a lot of things. So, Victoria, if there were 3 things that you really wanted to kind of drill down for people to utilize to start themselves on this journey, aside from getting your book, because clearly that's an obvious choice. Let's consider the book not one of the 3, because really it's something they should do. So let's say they buy the book. Let's think about 3 things that they really can begin to do to get to that place of owning their fear and living from love.
Well, you said the first one very clearly. We have to recognize that every single day, every single hour, every single minute, we have the choice between fear and love. Becoming conscious of that, becoming more and more conscious of how fear gets our ear, and then practicing love. I call the book Living Love because we have to practice living love. So choosing fear, practicing love, that is number 1. Number 2, I would have to say, is this practice of witnessing. It's a really beautiful practice. And it really has only one thing: learning to listen to your thoughts about yourself, about situations, about others, without judging yourself, literally witnessing. And once you can release that judgment, first of all, that's an heart-centered act towards yourself. But second of all, you begin to see things and you're like, oh, never saw that. Oh, yeah, well, that really doesn't serve me. So that's a really, really useful thing. And then I would say the last thing is, and we didn't touch on this, but recognizing that right here, right now, no matter what fear is telling you, you're okay. If you were listening to my voice, you're fine right now. And the best practice for really kind of cementing into your heart that sense that I'm okay right now is the practice of gratitude. It's a real game changer if you're in a place of anxiety or stress. just simply like crack out a piece of paper, use your phone, talk it into a voice memo, and start telling yourself all the things that you're grateful for. And what that gets you back to is one of the really important things, that if we can be present right here, right now, and in that presence, feel the power of love, because we've learned to witness and we've learned to choose and we've learned to practice, life becomes a lot simpler. And we stop being past thinkers or forward worriers, and we just think and be and live and lean and are right here now in the power of love. And that's a game changer.
I like that. We stop being past thinkers and forward worriers. Wow, there's a goal. There is a goal. Victoria, thank you so much for bringing your light and your wisdom and your authentic journey to my audience today. It's such a joy to connect with someone who has found that deeper spot and is willing to be vulnerable about the journey and allow other people to see what that looks and feels like. So thank you so much for doing that for us today.
Thank you for, having this conversation. I feel like we're having this powerful global conversation about love in 2020, and all of us need to do whatever we can do to keep it going.
Yes, that is the important piece, isn't it? Let's not get this quarantine over with and go on with life as usual. Let's learn from and shift from this global experience.
Yes.
Yes. Today, I've been speaking with Victoria Price. She's the author of The Way of Being Lost, and her current book is Living Love, 12 Heart-Centered Practices. If you head over to www.feminineroadmap.com/episode 165, there you are going to find links to her website, victoriaprice.com, and links to her book and her blog so that you can connect with her. Also, while you're there, please leave your name and email address and become a part of my tribe. Periodically, I do send out emails of encouragement, just kind of reminding you of what you may have missed in the podcasts and on my YouTube channel. And friends, when we have these conversations and it comes across your plate and you grab a cup of something wonderful and you sit down and listen to it, trust that that is a serendipitous moment, that you're listening to this is for a purpose. Take the time to pause and really think about what it is that this conversation has for you, not for anyone else. Think about yourself for a moment and gift yourself the time to pause and find out what it is that really matters to you and how you want to live because of this impact that's come into your life, either through the quarantine or this podcast. You really do have a purpose here on earth, friends. Please take that seriously and know that you matter. We're grateful that you're here. Do the things that are in your heart to do, and do them with as little fear as possible, because then the world is healed, one person at a time. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to more and more amazing conversations. Have a wonderful week, my friends. Take care. Bye-bye.